The air over the northern Vietnamese jungle is a thick green soup. It's July 17, 1945. Allison Thomas, a young American major with the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, stands at the edge of the plane's door. Below him is a sea of ancient trees, a place the French call Viet Minh. Somewhere down there, hidden in the limestone caves and dense canopy, is a man the Americans only know by the code name Lucius. Thomas checks his static line. They're not jumping into a known drop zone. They're jumping into a mystery. As the green light flashes, they step out into the void. When Major Thomas's parachute snaps open, the silence of the jungle rushes up to meet him. He lands in a clearing near a village called Tan Trao. Within minutes, the team is surrounded, but they aren't Japanese soldiers. They are thin, ragged men in indigo tunics carrying ancient flintlock rifles and bamboo spears. They don't shoot. Instead, they lead the Americans to a small thatched bamboo hut on a hillside. Inside, lying on a mat in a corner, is a man who looks more like a ghost than a revolutionary leader. He is skeletal, his eyes sunken from fever, his breath shallow. He looks like he's hours away from death. Major Thomas leans in. This is the man they came to find. This is Ho Chi Minh. Welcome to World War II Obscura. Years before the first American paratrooper ever landed in a Vietnamese jungle clearing, a different kind of war was being fought in the wood-paneled offices of Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt held a deep personal grudge against French colonial rule in Indochina. He didn't just see it as an old-world relic. He saw it as a brutal exploitation of a people who had been treated with what he called callous disregard for nearly a century. FDR's solution was a bold diplomatic gamble, an international trusteeship that would prevent the French from ever reclaiming their jewel of the Orient. But while American diplomats debated the future of a world they barely understood, the reality on the ground was far messier. The Japanese had effectively taken over, leaving a ghost-like French administration in place that was now answering to the pro-Nazi Vichy regime. Washington was flying blind in a region they knew almost nothing about. And as the war ground on, they realized they couldn't just plan for Vietnam's future. They needed to find someone inside it who was willing to help them win the war. In the summer of 1945, the world was on the brink of a new era. In Europe, the Nazis had fallen. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was reeling from the island-hopping campaigns. But in Southeast Asia, in the colony known as French Indochina, the situation was a chaotic mess of overlapping agendas. The French, who had ruled the region for 80 years, had been humiliated by the Japanese. The Japanese were now the masters, but their grip was slipping. The stuck in the middle were the Vietnamese, a people who had spent 1,000 years fighting for independence and were now being crushed between two empires. Enter the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The Americans needed intelligence. They needed to know where the Japanese were moving their troops. They needed to rescue pilots who were being shot down over the jungle, and they were looking for anyone, communist, nationalist, or bandit, who was willing to fight against the Japanese. They found their man in Ho Chi Minh. It didn't start with a formal treaty. It started with a downed pilot. A few months earlier, Lieutenant William Shaw, an American pilot, was forced to bail out of his P-51 Mustang over the mountains of Tonkin. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, but he wasn't alone for long. A group of local guerrillas found him. They were members of the Viet Minh, a nationalist front led by a man the world would soon know as Ho. Ho Chi Minh saw an opportunity. He didn't turn Shaw over to the Japanese for the reward. He didn't hide him away. He personally walked Shaw across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain all the way to the Chinese border. When they arrived at the American air base in Kunming, Ho didn't ask for money. He asked for a meeting. He wanted to talk to the Americans. Specifically, he wanted to talk to Charles Finn, an OSS operative who was looking for a way to get spies into Indochina. Ho and Finn met in a small, quiet room. Finn was struck by the man's presence. Ho was soft-spoken, articulate, and deeply knowledgeable about world affairs. He told Finn he was ready to help. He said he had thousands of men ready to fight. Ho made a strange request. He wanted a signed autograph of General Claire Chennault, the legendary leader of the Flying Tigers, and he wanted an OSS code name. Finn was confused. Why a photo? But he got it. Chennault signed a headshot. To Mr. Ho, with best wishes, Claire. Ho took that photo back into the jungle like it was a holy relic. To his rivals in the resistance, the photo was proof. It said, "The Americans are with me." It was a masterstroke of political theater. With a single photograph, Ho Chi Minh consolidated his power and became the primary American contact in the region. He was given the code name Agent Lucius. Fast forward back to that sickly Ho in July 1945. Major Thomas and his dear team have just arrived, and their agent Lucius is dying. Ho is suffering from a lethal combination of malaria and dengue fever. He's so weak he can't even sit up. If Ho Chi Minh had died that night in the jungle, the entire history of the 20th century would be different. There might have been no Vietnam War as we know it, no fall of Saigon, no 58,000 American names on a black granite wall in Washington. But the Americans didn't see a future enemy. They saw a friend and a valuable ally. OSS medic Paul Hoagland stepped forward. He didn't ask about Ho's politics. He opened his medical kit. He administered sulfa drugs and quinine. For days, the Americans stayed by Ho's side, nursing him back to health. Slowly, the fever broke. The old man, as the Americans called him, began to eat again. As Ho recovered, the mission began in earnest. The Americans set up a training camp in a clearing they called Kem Lung. Imagine the scene. A handful of elite American paratroopers, the best trained soldiers in the world, standing in a jungle clearing with 200 Vietnamese guerrillas. Most of these men had never seen a modern weapon. Some had only used bamboo spears or flintlock muskets that looked like they belonged in the American Revolution. The Deer Team, led by U.S. Army Major Allison Thomas and OSS agent Henry Prunier, started from scratch. They taught them how to disassemble an M1 carbine. They showed them how to fire a bazooka, a weapon the Vietnamese called Ong Coi Bep, or translated to English, the stovepipe. There was a genuine bond forming. The Americans and the Vietnamese ate the same food, drank from the same bottle, slept on the same dirt floors, and shared the same cigarettes. They were the Viet American force. They even designed a banner with the American and Vietnamese flags side by side. Prunier would later call the Vietnamese incredibly fast learners. They were motivated. They weren't just fighting for the Americans. They were fighting for their own homes. But the clock was ticking. In August 1945, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Suddenly, the war was over. The Japanese had surrendered. In the power vacuum that followed, Ho Chi Minh didn't hesitate. He knew the French were coming back to reclaim their colony. He knew he had to act fast. He ordered his newly trained Viet American force to march on Hanoi. The march was a triumph. Everywhere they went, people flocked to the Viet Minh. And right there in the middle of the column, riding in trucks and walking alongside Ho's guerrillas, were the Americans of the OSS. To the people of Vietnam, it looked like the United States was personally escorting Ho Chi Minh to power. On September 2nd, 1945, the world changed. A massive crowd of nearly 500,000 gathered at Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square. Ho Chi Minh stood on a raised wooden dais. He was wearing a faded khaki suit and rubber sandals. Standing near him were the Americans of the OSS. A band began to play, but it wasn't a Vietnamese revolutionary song. It was the Star-Spangled Banner. Above the crowd, American P-38 Lightning fighters buzzed the square, not as enemies, but as a flyover salute. Ho Chi Minh stepped to the microphone. He looked out to the sea of faces and began to speak. His first words weren't from Marx or Lenin. They were from another revolutionary, Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was quoting the American Declaration of Independence. He even used the word Vietnam for the first time in a formal declaration. He was reaching out to the Americans, practically begging for their support against the return of French colonialism. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like a new era of friendship was beginning. The OSS officers in Hanoi, like Archimedes Patty, were writing reports back to Washington urging the government to support Ho. They argued that he was a nationalist first and a communist second. They said he was someone the U.S. could work with. But back in Washington, the logic of the world was also shifting. The big picture was taking over. President Roosevelt, who'd been a fierce critic of colonialism, was dead. Harry Truman was now in charge at the White House. The French were screaming for their colony back. They argued that if the U.S. didn't help them, France might fall to communism in Europe. In the emerging Cold War, France was a real power. The Vietnamese were just a minor group in a distant jungle. Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman. He asked for American recognition. He asked for help in building a democratic Vietnam. Truman never answered a single one. The OSS was ordered to leave. The Deer Team was disbanded. As Major Allison Thomas and his men prepared to fly out of Hanoi, they felt a sense of dread. They had seen the passion of the Vietnamese. They'd seen the training they'd provided. They saw that the Viet Minh marched under a banner reading Vietnam, independence or death. They knew what was coming. One of the last Americans to leave Hanoi was Archimedes Patty. As he said goodbye to Ho, the old man looked at him with a mix of sadness and resolve. He knew the Americans were choosing the French. The alliance was over. These unexpected allies were now on a collision course. The men who had trained together in the jungle clearing at Tan Trao would soon be fighting each other. The M1 carbines the Americans had given the Viet Minh would eventually be turned on American soldiers. The tactics of guerrilla warfare that the OSS had taught Ho's men would be used to trap and kill Americans 20 years later. History is often seen as a series of inevitable events. We think the Vietnam War had to happen. But when you look at the story of the Deer Team and Agent Lucius, you see that it wasn't inevitable. There was a choice. The OSS men who were there, Thomas, Prunier, Patty, spent the rest of their lives wondering what if. They had glimpsed a version of the future where the U.S. and Vietnam were partners. They'd seen a version where the bloodshed of the 60s never happened. We should care about this story because it reminds us once more that in war, human connections outpace political ideology. For a few months in 1945, a handful of Americans and Vietnamese imposed a kind of hopeful order on the chaos of World War II. They saw each other as individuals, as comrades, as humans. The tragedy isn't that we became enemies. The tragedy is that we were friends first. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think we should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.